Mortal Kombat 2 is the pinnacle of the Mortal Kombat series. It featured more characters, more over-the-top fatalities, and a more fleshed out storyline. It felt like a natural progression of the Mortal Kombat series. Once again, Acclaim procured the rights to publish the home console release of the game. While Acclaim's ad campaign of MK2 didn't seem to carry the same impact as their MK1 campaign did, their presence was definitely felt, with such ads as this. Mortal Kombat 2 was released on even more systems than MK1. Let's take a look at the releases on the home consoles. Since the Master System at this point was still popular in Europe, Acclaim released a port of MK2 for the system, exclusively to that region. The game was really a bare bones version of MK2. You didn't have the beginning intro story, and you're missing quite a few characters in the game. You only have one main fatality per character. There are no friendships or babalities whatsoever. Like in MK1, there's only two stages in the game: the Pit 2 and the Combat 2. You can't do the Pit fatality on the Pit 2, though you can hit your opponent on the spikes in the Combat 2. The graphics again are pretty decent for the 8-bit system, and the controls are improved over MK1, but they are still a bit sluggish. The sound effects and music in the game are again pretty unrecognizable, but they were able to include having the announcer say "fight" in the game. Believe it or not, you can fight Jade and Smoke at an alternate version of the Tomb stage, but Noob Saibot has been omitted. Some of the fatalities have been altered as well, such as Reptile's head chomp. Instead, he sucks you in like Melina. As expected, there are no end pictures when you beat the game, just text. Like MK1 for some odd reason, I like playing this version, even though it is pretty crappy. Now let's take a look at the Genesis version. Acclaim's team ported this game a lot better than they did with MK1. While not perfect by any means, it's definitely more of an acceptable port. While MK2 in general had better graphics than MK1, one would think that the Genesis port would obviously look worse than MK1 did, but believe it or not, that wasn't the case here. The developers really pushed the Genesis to get respectable graphics out of the system. It's still missing a few frames of animation, but it's nowhere near as choppy as the MK1 characters look. You can see this in their fighting stances, as well as some of the characters' winning poses. Like Baraka's here. As you can see, he never finishes it. A move that is missing from all the characters is their crouch punch, which is kind of sad because it did come in handy from time to time. Instead, they just do an uppercut. There is no story in the beginning of the game at all, nor is there any bio screens. The stages are missing a few details here and there, and instead of having you return to Goro's lair when you fight a secret character, you go to the portal stage, where they switch the color palette a little. All the fatalities, friendships, babalities, and secret characters have been put into the game at least. The sound of the game is really not too great. The music and sound effects are what can be expected from the Genesis. The system is getting pretty old at this point, so you're missing some stuff like the voice announcer and some of the voices for the characters. A lot of Shao Kahn's voice is missing from the game. The music again is altered from the original tracks, but it's actually not that bad. The controls of the game are once again solid, just as they were in MK1. The game endings are pretty weak because they just have your character's story in text. Even with the missing components, the Genesis port still ends up being an enjoyable game. Now for probably my favorite port of the game, the Super Nintendo version. Nintendo finally gave in and decided to include blood in the game. Even back in '94, this port received great reviews. A lot of people were surprised what they were able to pull off with this port. The graphics, while not arcade perfect, were great, even though the music and sound effects were compressed, and in some cases just missing, they were still pretty impressive for the time. They did include the beginning story in the beginning of the game, though the arcade pictures weren't included. You just saw text. The beginning bios were included with the arcade pictures, though they were scaled down a bit. The characters' animations were pretty smooth, and missing only a frame or two. The stages were represented pretty accurately, but some of the small details were missing, such as the pillars in the portal stage. The sound is a mixed bag of original compressed music and slightly altered tracks. Some sound effects have been changed and reused in other places, but all in all, they did a pretty good job trying to emulate the better sounding, though mono, DCS sound system the arcade version had. One thing that always bothered me about this version was the final fight with Shao Kahn. Instead of having the original grunt sound effects that he had in the arcade version, the programmers placed Kentaro's roar in its place. It still kinda works, but it would have been better to have the original version. All of the fatalities, babalities, friendships, and hidden characters are present in this port. Acclaim actually made use of the SNES's Mode 7 capability by making the background when you fall into the pit rotate a little, something not even present in the arcade version. They also managed to have the pictures from the arcade endings, but they were scaled down a little. At the time of its release, the SNES version was the definitive console version. Well, maybe only in the US though. The Japanese SNES version of this game was slightly altered. Instead of red blood, it had green blood. Instead of a full-colored fatality, the game changed to a black and white screen. I'm sure that because of this, that the Japanese crowd doesn't think highly of the SNES version of this game.